Welcome back to UC Davis Live, COVID-19. I'm Satirius Johnson. Reminder that you can see this video and watch it live after the broadcast as well. UC Davis Facebook, as you can see it there. You can see it on Twitter, on YouTube channels. We're also aware that others are pointing links saying you have to pay to watch this video. Please do not click on those links. This is a free webcast. Today we're talking about how children and parents can manage the stress and anxiety of going back to school this fall. A new school year is always an exciting and stressful time for children and parents alike. And this year, there's the added stress, of course, of coronavirus, whether children are headed to real classrooms or with the safety precautions in place, or just online classrooms with their own stress points. Here to help us get some insight are two psychologists from the UC Davis Mind Institute. Brianna Winder-Patel is a clinical psychologist at the UC Davis Mind Institute and assistant clinical professor in the Department of Pediatrics. Her clinic specializes in treating anxiety through cognitive behavioral therapy, and she carries out research on anxiety in people with autism spectrum disorder and intellectual disability. Marjorie Solomon is professor of clinical psychiatry in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at UC Davis. She's on the faculty of the Mind Institute and of the postdoctoral autism research training program. She's a licensed psychologist whose primary clinical work is focused on high-functioning children, adolescents, and young adults with ASD. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
We are taking audience questions, so if you're watching us live, just leave them in the comment section and we'll work in as many as we can. So Dr. Winder-Patel, I'm sure most of us have experienced anxiety or what we think is anxiety at different points in our lives, but in medical terms, what do we mean when we talk about anxiety?
Yeah, so anxiety is something we need to have. If we didn't have it, it would be a problem because you want to have some, and if you're in a real danger, you need to feel anxious and do what you can to get out of that danger. But for some people, it goes beyond that and it reaches a level where it's really causing interference into their lives. It's causing problems because of the anxiety is so high and the severity is high. And when we're talking about anxiety, another way of thinking of it is difficulty with tolerating uncertainty. And so we have a lot of uncertainty right now with this COVID situation and just all the things going on in the world. So it's not a surprise that it's higher for a lot of people right now, but there are some things we can do to cope ourselves and help our children cope.
Well, before we get to that, how does anxiety show up in children?
Yeah, it's actually can show up in many different ways, which makes it difficult to detect sometimes, especially with young children or children with reduced language ability. So one way it can show up is physical symptoms like stomach aches and headaches when they're forced to face things that make them anxious. Another way it can show up is avoiding things like I don't want to sleep in my bed by myself because I'm too scared. Another way it can show up is asking a lot of what if questions. What if I go out in public and I catch COVID today? Or really needing a lot of reassurance from parents, like asking parents, am I going to be okay if I go to school? Or am I going to be okay if I go in the grocery store with you? So if we see a lot of this and it's causing problems in the child's life and interfering with their ability to just function as we would expect, then we're sort of thinking it's at that higher level of anxiety.
I would imagine a lot of it is kind of like the unknown. I mean, this is a new virus and kids are even more confused than adults about it, I'm sure. So I guess part of it might be just defining what you have in your control, right? I mean, and just saying, well, this is what we can control and this is what we can't. So we kind of tailor our behavior around what we know.
Yes, that's a great way to think of it. And actually, you can probably tell in this house by me saying this, we've seen some Frozen 2 over the course of this, but Olaf has a comment where he says, we're calling this controlling what you can when things feel out of control. And that's exactly right. It helps children to identify what can we control, that we can wash our hands and we can wear masks in public. And what can't we control? What supplies might be available or whether we're going to see our friend anytime soon. That there's a lot right now that's just uncertain. So it's that piece that can be helpful to clarify with kids.
With this new school year coming up and with all these concerns about COVID-19, how are you seeing it affecting the mental health of children?
Yeah, so I think that, some kids actually are feeling a little less anxious because they're at home more, they're in their safe space, they aren't needing to face some of the things that would maybe make them more anxious, like social interactions or being in group settings. But for some kids, the anxiety is going a little bit higher and, related to that uncertainty. So for this piece, we really want to understand what the thoughts are that the children are having, because then that can help us work on a strategy and help the children cope. So we don't want to assume that kids are more anxious about this, because a lot of kids, especially young kids, their experience is what we as adults kind of convey to them. So if we're saying, oh, we're staying home more, but we're going to do some good things as a family, and some days might be stressful, but we're really going to work on being flexible all together as a family and being brave when we need to. That's very different than kids getting yelled at a lot for staying 6 feet away or not putting their mask on. So there's a lot that is expected of families right now, but there are some ways to make it go a little bit easier.
Well, I have a related question from someone who's watching. Julie on Facebook is asking, how can parents and teachers communicate with their children or students without projecting their own fears and anxiety onto the children?
Yeah, so one thing can be to model coping strategies yourself. So I think that sometimes as parents, we feel like we have to shield all the stress from the children, but we actually don't want our children to grow up with no stress or challenges. It's kind of better for them to feel like there are challenges, but we'll find a way to work through them. So kind of modeling for yourself, wow, I just got some really stressful news about my work situation. I would like to pick a helpful choice and I'd like to go for a walk. Do you want to come with me? And so I think that we're asking parents to do really kind of miraculous things at this time with juggling how much they need to, and parents trying to think about, are there ways they can cope so that our children don't just get the side effects of how stressed out we are.
Right. I think I'd like to just say that is an incredibly important issue. I think during this time, there's stress on everyone, and parents that are working as well as caring for children in the home and helping with education are under an enormous amount of stress. Even more so perhaps in families with kids with developmental disabilities and potentially autism. And so it's very important for all of us to take good care of ourselves by instituting coping strategies that help us, taking those walks, having that quiet dinner with your partner, doing the things that bring you joy, and giving yourself a little time so that you have the strength to help your children in all the ways that Brianna suggests.
It's often, easy to forget about self-care, but that's part of the whole picture.
Right, for sure. Just wanted to say that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have another question. Kate, who's watching on Facebook, is asking, what are the best questions teachers can use to gauge students' mental health? And I guess the same could go for parents and their children.
Yeah, so I think if teachers, districts have very different formats in how they're, interacting with the kids over distance learning. And I think that if there is a possibility to have the videos on for kids to have that face-to-face interaction with the teachers and the other kids, and to just kind of, teachers are really good at this, like just checking in with kids and saying, how's it going? And let's maybe talk about one thing that was kind of tough this week and think together how we could work on that, and maybe one thing that was really, really great. Because the other thing is that, there's often something in every day that a kid sees as kind of good or positive, and sometimes even noticing that out loud can help, reduce stress and show that the teacher cares for them and that they're kind of understanding of what the situation is like.
And I think it's really important also for teachers to make the kind of time to help children have that one-on-one time with them. And I know in many cases that is happening in different classrooms. And if certain kids are in need of more support, that can be something that parents ask for as well, in order to reassure their children and to maintain that bond between child and teacher.
It looks like most kids, at least in California, will be going to school remotely this fall. Do you see that changing the stresses and anxiety for children? Will it throw more stress onto parents as well?
Yeah, I think that I'm getting a lot of mixed, responses about that from families I see in clinic and just, in my own experience with my child's school, is that I think for some people it's a little bit of a relief if you have a medical condition or you're more at risk. And, it might feel safer to stay home. And if they're able to help their child with distance learning, for others, this is really a struggle, being asked to work from home and also somehow help with your child's distance learning is really, really stressful. I think that again, this piece comes back to parents kind of being a little bit like easy on themselves, not being super hard and expecting that they're going to be like the best teacher that ever happened if they were never trained to be a teacher. And to be able to kind of just be aware of how your child's doing. Sometimes it can really help to reward children for things we sort of expect anyway, but in this situation, it's much harder, like rewarding them for flexibility. I noticed you were so flexible today when we couldn't get the mic to work on your Zoom call. That was really amazing. Or rewarding for bravery. I know it felt like it looked uncomfortable for you to get on that Zoom video, and I know you didn't want to do it, but you pushed through and did it. And, that was really brave. So sometimes we forget to really pay attention to the things children do well because we're just so relieved that that it went well, but that can go a long way.
Yeah. Positive communication, and not just kind of, tamping down the feelings. I mean, everybody's anxious. It's okay to recognize that. And we know what we know, and we don't know what we don't know. Mm-hmm. And we're going to get through this.
Yeah.
And, I think you're making a really good point, is that parents tend to know their children really well, and they can speak with their children, give their children a chance to voice the special kinds of fears and anxieties that they may have about going back to school or anything related to COVID. I think fortunately our parents with kids with autism may be pretty good at doing things like that already, because it's what we teach. You can't just expect because you see a particular behavior in a child with autism that you know what they're thinking and feeling. And that is true for all children. You really have to kind of try to get down to their developmental level and understand what it is that makes them afraid. I mean, I think Dr. Winter Patel had an amazing story when she was doing one of her interviews recently with a child who was very frightened about COVID, and this was a child with autism. And the reason the child was afraid was because they thought that little ball with the red spikes was inside their body. And that was a very frightening thought, but unless you took the time to really talk with the child about what particularly made them afraid, you wouldn't understand that. And so it really behooves parents to take the time to feel exactly what different things are making their children act the way they do during this really unusual time.
We have another viewer question. Deepanchi on Facebook is asking, do you have any tips to identify anxiety in and help kids who are going to be doing online learning for this academic year?
Is this from, to help their own kids, or is it like how a teacher would notice?
I'm going to guess, I don't know, it's not clear, but why don't we do both? Why don't we hit both?
Yeah, so I think tips for your own child would be to just kind of not assume that they're sort of ready for this and that they have some certainty about this. The thing with anxiety, it is the intolerance or the difficulty with uncertainty, and we don't want to make everything certain for them because that's not how the world works, but we all feel a little better if we are more prepared. So possibly doing a Zoom trial, if that's the way the learning is going to occur, and maybe it's a different format from last year, or setting up with the child, talking to the child beforehand. What are your thoughts related to starting this school year? I had a child recently tell me her biggest worry was whether she'd be able to log in on time. And she's not a child who's ever been late. So we had to work through this thought because it's an excessive thought. We don't have proof or evidence that this will for sure be a problem for her. And so setting it up, getting the questions out there, and then figuring out how to address them. And one way I do that often is to say, I teach children that there's this thing called anxiety, and we need some of it, but sometimes it gets too much. And when it gets too much, we have to be like private investigators and we have to catch it because we don't have to listen to it when it hits that point. So I teach children, be aware that the anxiety bully could mess with you and what would that look like. And so with the child worrying about logging in on time, she's worked with me for a while and I said, okay, so do we have any proof or evidence that this will be a problem for you? And she's like, no, I make all of our sessions on time. I do all this myself. Okay, so do you think that's a realistic thought or the anxiety bully is messing with you? Oh, I think it's definitely messing with me. So what can we do about that? Like, do we have to listen to it? No, we don't. Actually, we can say that's just a thought and I can choose to think about other things right now and have a coping thought. Like, I'm usually an on-time person. And if I'm late, it's likely the teacher will be flexible because this is so new. So there's lots of ways to work through the thought process rather than just saying, don't worry, or it'll be fine. Because I think as parents, we tend to do that, but they are worried. So that doesn't really reassure them. It's this more active approach. And it could be the case, with teachers too, to more actively try to take the pulse of the room and say, is there anything somebody's, not sure of, or anyone that needs help with something? Now, children might be worried to volunteer, but some might get those, questions out there and it can help the whole group.
To the more general...
Oh, go ahead. Yes, please.
Sorry. To the more general point of just preparing for this coming year, I think it goes a long way when parents work with their children to kind of know what to expect. And so when we work, especially with children with developmental disabilities, but for all children, we often really try to prepare them for what's coming up. And we can do this in several ways. I mean, we can use visual schedules and let them know, we have a new routine this year at school. This is what you're going to be doing online time. This might be a breakout room. This might be some time to go outside and get physical activity. But we can post visual schedules for the children that prepare them for the things that are coming up during a day. And that can really be used to help minimize their anxiety about what to expect. For areas that prove to be particularly challenging, we can also help them by using a technique called social stories, which is where we take events that may have been problematic for children in the past, maybe raising your hand in class or knowing how to log on and make stories that you can tell the children. They can even keep them in a book, use simple declarative kind of sentences talking about, when we get ready to go online in the morning, we do, first we turn on our computer, then we do this, then we, check our microphone and see if our camera's on or not. And so just very simple steps that kind of give the children a script to know if that anxiety takes over, they can go to the script and feel a little bit calmer.
That's great advice. I want to remind people that if you're watching live, that's great. You can also watch this video after the live broadcast on the UC Davis Facebook site, Twitter, and the YouTube channels. And we are aware of others posting links saying you have to pay to watch this video. Please do not click on those links. This is a free web stream, a free video to watch online. And we are taking questions. So if you are watching on the live stream and like to ask a question, just drop it into the comment section and we will work it in. We do have another question from a viewer, Lena, who's watching on Facebook, asks, there's a high chance that my kids, ages 9 and 5, will have distance learning the whole year. How to keep connections with their peers apart from Zoom calls? How can they do that?
Yeah, so I think it depends, where you are and the conditions of your family, whether anything can occur in person to a level of social distance. And if it cannot, it's really challenging to go this long without seeing peers. There's, other than the school and related Zoom calls, there's things kids can do to still connect with each other. So other, virtual ways of having like play dates and things like that. Also, kids could, make cards or make projects and send them to their kid in the mail. It's a little old-fashioned, but still fun. My child loves getting mail. So, still trying to do things to just keep that kind of connection there and for the child to understand that, even if we don't see a friend every day, it doesn't mean that friend went away. And we can still express to them that we're thinking about them and reach out to them in these various different ways. It's for sure difficult though. There's barriers to it, but any other virtual ways, any other ways they can message them or send things to them. And then I know some families who, in a Zoom way, they're saying like, okay, both bring your favorite item and talk about it, or both get the same Lego set or a similar one and build it over Zoom together. So even though it's the virtual format, it can feel like they're kind of having more of an actual interaction.
Mm-hmm. I think also one exciting development I wanted to mention at UC Davis, COVID, as Brianna was mentioning, has been, very, very challenging, but it's also made us have to think in new ways. So one of the programs we've run consistently for the last 20 years at the Mind has been a social skills intervention program for children with autism spectrum disorder. And when COVID hit, we were in the middle of our live in-person groups, and those could no longer continue, which was really disappointing to the participants. So we started doing a series of online game nights where we would play games. There are online games that one can purchase, and they're things like treasure hunts and making funny Mad Lib kind of comments back and forth to each other. And we found that the kids really enjoyed that. So this year we are in the process of trying to design a fully online social skills curriculum for children with autism. And I think hopefully you all can post a link to our wonderful program coordinator, Karen Chalmers, who can keep you up to date on developments there. But there we're going to be developing ways that we can teach some of the similar skills that we did in an in-person social group online. And we're hoping that that will be available by January. So, and I would be surprised if there weren't other efforts like that. I also have heard of people being very creative and doing things like drive-by birthday parties and drive-by graduations, which, while not perfect, are a nice recognition of a birthday event. So.
Right. It keeps that social connection, even though it's at a distance and a drive-by. I wanted to ask you, Dr. Solomon, you're leading a study of anxiety in kids with autism spectrum disorder. What are the special challenges of a situation like this for these kids and their parents?
Well, I'm the principal investigator of the study, but Dr. Winder Patel also works with me on that study. And I think, as she was alluding to, it's been very eye-opening for us to see the very different kind of responses that some of our participants have to COVID. While some of them are extremely anxious, perhaps about their parents leaving to go to work and getting sick, or not being able to do their routines, some children are actually feeling are actually feeling a little bit safer because they don't have to venture out to school where they typically have a lot of problems. But as she was saying, there are definitely ways that you can tell that children with autism might be anxious. For our kids with autism, they have something called special interests. So they might be extremely interested in Pokemon or extremely interested in Legos, and will lecture you about those topics for long periods of time, or watch Frozen incessantly, which typical kids also do, and lecture you a lot about what's going on. Sometimes we can tell that children are extra anxious when they resort to using their special interests more than usual. Other times, kids will have behavioral problems, and you'll think that they had really crossed a bridge and weren't doing something anymore, like having tantrums or not wanting to go to bed or not wanting to eat certain foods. But they might have a small regression in there. You have to use your patience and your kindness and your toolkit and your detective skills to try to figure out, are there things they're anxious about that they haven't had a chance to talk about, that we haven't had a chance to try to problem solve around. So I think that, those kinds of things are, do come up in this kind of a time.
We have another viewer question. Nalita on Facebook is asking, excuse me, she writes, my son, who is a high functioning autistic, is very anxious about not being able to go back to school and seeing his friends and teachers. He doesn't like school, but he now misses it so much. We take walks just so he can see the school. Our district has a great support system for distance learning, but it's just not the same. Do you have any tips?
Yeah, I mean, I would want to know, is there any way there can be a little more connection between the child and those peers or the teacher that the child is missing? So, could the child make something for them and send it? Could they, I've worked with some people who are into the whole painting rocks thing. So they, paint rocks and they give them to the friend, and then the friend goes and puts the rocks out, and then you can track where who finds the rocks. So it's like this whole thing that goes on. But again, more ways to try to get that connection there. I would also want to know, how much they understand about the reason why we're not doing school in person. If there's been a way that that's been described, that's been really clear that it's but we would want it in a pretty just clear way, like we're really trying to keep it so that not too many people are in the hospital at one time, and we don't have the ability to care for all these people. So it's something that, we have to do that. Again, we don't have that control over. But what do we have control over? We can take walks by the school. We can send things to the teacher or the peers. We can, write about it or draw about it and express feelings in that way.
I think it's really lovely what the mom is doing in this case, taking him on walks. I think that's a great part of a routine that may help him feel better. And, other parts of the routine could be things like, it could be, online. They do lunch bunches in some schools for children with autism, who have some difficulty with socializing. Perhaps there could be some creative solution around something like that, where several children, his friends could arrange to have a lunch bunch on sort of a regular basis, and that could become part of his routine and something that he would look forward to. And, maybe there's an opportunity here. If before he hated school and now he's seeing, you don't know what you got till it's gone. And, going forward, there may be some creative things and ways you can speak with the child like that about school and the good parts of school.
Right. Are there things teachers can do that could make it easier?
Well, they could help with some of those lunch bunch ideas, I believe, and as we talked about a little bit at the beginning of the show, making themselves more available to the children themselves. Teachers have different ways of wanting to meet with their students, but individualized meetings, meetings where there might be several children who are typically friends together with a facilitated kind of activity could be really helpful. Depending on the age of the child, the developmental level of the child. Another thing I forgot to say before that I think is very important is that some of our children have intellectual disability, and it becomes really difficult for them to communicate with us what they're thinking and feeling. And for those kinds of kids, you had asked me, how do we know if a child's anxious? Those children might have a lot of those kind of acting out behaviors where we really don't know the meaning. So it's hard, and you really have to be a good detective to figure that out. And in those cases, I think, again, getting back into a routine is really helpful. And teachers might be able to help advise parents who aren't special educators about ways to manage those situations too.
Because each person will react differently and will communicate with their behavior differly. So you really have to
be a good sleuth and figure it out.
And I think another way to do that is thinking about avoidance. So avoidance of something is a sign of anxiety. It could just be that it's non-preferred, but it could be they're avoiding it because they're anxious. So if you're, this is the thing that probably comes up the most in my clinic right now is kids not wanting to have their camera on Zoom. They're anxious of what will the other kids think of me, or what will the teacher think, or will I do something wrong? And they would like to avoid it. And that can be a sign of anxiety. And what we want to do is help them kind of push through and face it, because there's a lot more social interaction possible with the video on than off. So avoidance is a big sign that we look for. And like Marjorie mentioned, some of these kind of acting out behaviors or getting aggressive when asked to do something that might make them anxious, or trying to run away. those are these behavioral things we have to kind of look for if we can't get the information from their verbals, from their language.
Right, right. Corinne on Facebook is asking, as a parent, what can we do to help our kids to stay focused and engaged on distance learning? What can we do to ensure distance learning is successful so kids aren't behind when choosing distance learning over an on-campus education?
So in terms of keeping focused, the one suggestion would be, if possible in your house, to have a space that is just devoted to the distance learning. If you're kind of in your bed or you're sort of like on a couch, that might be harder than replicating the classroom as much as possible in your house. Having a desk if possible, or a table, and a space that you're really not expecting them to do a lot of other things in that space but learn. And setting that routine of, this is what we do, and we go to this space, and this is the learning space. But when we take breaks or when we have lunch, we go to the more fun, relaxing spaces. And then, like Marjorie was mentioning, kind of that schedule, like them knowing what to come. Well, this is the time we really need to focus, but then there's going to be a break for lunch, and you and I will walk outside, or, whatever you can do to kind of get them to refresh so they can focus more. And you said a second question, but I'm not recalling what that was.
Let me see if I can find it here. Because I jumped around. Let's see.
I was focusing.
Okay, yeah. So making sure that distance learning is successful so they don't fall behind. Yeah. Some school systems are allowing kids to decide, or parents to decide, whether you want to come to school even for part of the day or to just do 100% distance learning. And so I guess that's part of the calculus when people are trying to decide, benefits versus the risks involved. So how can you ensure, if you're, choosing to stay home, whether you're not going to fall behind?
Yeah, I think, even with distance learning, the districts and the teachers are putting out curriculum with the expectation that those things are what would keep them on track and that they're completing them. I would say, if the child is doing well and completing all of them, the teacher would be gauging whether they're staying on track. If the child's really struggling and not completing any of it, then that would be more of the concern, and it would be a conversation to be had as soon as possible with the teacher that we're doing everything we can. Do you have any other suggestions? Are there ways we can do some more hands-on learning to supplement this, because the video format isn't working as well for my child? So, teachers are great at this and figuring this out, and hopefully the parents feel comfortable engaging them when they need to.
Just another point I wanted to make to the person's comment about staying engaged in online learning is the importance of physical activity. So in the schedule, there should definitely be, short classroom times, interspersed with activities that can help children to self-regulate and blow off a little steam and become back more alert. So again, I think it kind of goes back to a clever schedule for the child.
And I'm sorry, do you want
to add? A tailored schedule, knowing the way your child works.
I mean, having structure in general is just a good idea.
Structure is good.
Yeah, structure is good. Anne on Facebook is asking, in addition to online schooling, kids also relax online with games, etc. I'm worried my kids are in their rooms getting too comfortable with isolation. Is that something we should be concerned about, or just let it go?
Well, I think this is one of those things that it depends on the degree to which it's happening. That we know that lots of screen time is generally not great for kids. So this makes this even more challenging right now, especially if it's close to bedtime. So actually being on screens that emit a blue ray can kind of send a message to your melatonin that it's not time to sleep yet. So what I try to do with most of my kids is say at least an hour or more before bedtime to kind of go screen free, to give your brain the chance for it to release the melatonin as it naturally wants to. And then during the day to try to set some limits on it. Now, if you are working from home the whole day and your child is home the whole day, sometimes that might be the only option you have. And then it's like, well, let's try on the weekends to be outside for a good portion of the day or offset that time. Of course, playing games, doing things in person like crafts and drawing and all of those things, and kind of accessing the world in terms of being outside and in nature are great things, but we have to be realistic right now too. So it's a balance, and every family knows what's possible for them. And if they get more screen time one day, maybe try to offset it another day.
Yeah, I think it's good natural practice in your family about, valuing not spending all your time on the screen is important, but we have to cut ourselves slack, as we talked about before. If things are super stressful and challenging, sometimes in these days, you're going to have to let that go a bit.
Right. I think the concern also is about isolation. So I think maybe just even having meals together, a lot of families got out of the practice of having dinner together sometimes. And so you're at home, okay, we're going to have lunch together, we're going to have dinner together. Just having the social interaction must be a positive thing.
Mm-hmm.
With your family, with your brother.
Yes.
Yeah.
So limiting how much they're allowed to just be in their room alone, and maybe an event you pick for the weekend is a family movie night, but popping the popcorn and having the family choose it together and hang out together and talk about it is definitely different from just being in your room by yourself playing video games. So there are ways to kind of, bridge that gap, but be mindful that we just don't think it's, the best to have high amounts of screen time by yourself.
Soteria, you're reminding me also of another comment. I'm a little older than Brianna, so my children are young adult children. And I think parents are facing unique stresses around this time with their young adult children as well. I had one son who finished college online, and that created interesting issues around our family, and another son who's been home, working from home part of the time. And I think they're also really interesting family issues that, create new needs for families to cope with. It's wonderful. I think a lot of us never anticipated that we'd have our adult children back home with us ever again. And lo and behold, we do.
Be careful what you wish for, right?
Exactly. Although, we've had some fun times. We've had some fun times that I never thought we would have had before. But I think my children have said, gee, I wish I weren't here more than once too. So.
Well, we have a related question from someone watching, from a few people watching, questions related to supporting tweens and teens. So are there any specific resources and tips you would suggest for them?
Well, I think a lot of the things we've talked about today, you just have to sort of developmentally move them up a tier. There are definitely lots of fun games that you can play online. And so, making peer-to-peer interaction important is something that, I would recommend. Obviously you have less control over teens and tweens and young adults than you do with younger children, but, continuing to try to espouse the same values of wanting to get together with our friends and doing family activities that are age appropriate, that aren't too not cool, which can be quite a challenge, I might add, or sharing in chores, because when teens come home, I haven't cooked so much dinner, I got to tell you, for many years. It's rather a shock. I think that having everyone pitch in and help around the house is super important and a way to stay engaged together. So.
We have a question from Francesca on Facebook, getting back to kind of like the isolation issue. Will the lack of social interaction for our kids and their peers and this extended distance learning timeline, will our kids have long-term effects? I would imagine that maybe for younger kids, it might have more long-lasting effects than older kids, but do we have any research or any evidence of?
I don't think we can know that for sure, but I do think one interesting thing about the pandemic is it's really hastened a lot of changes in our society. So I wouldn't be totally surprised if there's more distance type activities in general, including learning in the future. So I think we're all adjusting to this new reality, and we just have to kind of take it as it goes. I think using common sense and trying to get people to still talk to people is obviously a good thing, be they family members or friends online. So.
Right.
Yeah, and I think in general, kids are really resilient, and it's that way that we present some of these challenges and information to them. If we're really taking this time to, you know, whenever we think of it, to work on bravery and adaptability and kind of flexibility. That's going to be skills that they'll have for their whole life. And, you know, we as adults and parents are really working on them ourselves right now. So modeling that for kids. We don't know what will happen long term, but I do think the households where the tensions are really high and the stress is really high without any relief is, you know, more concerning. And in some ways, you know, we aren't able to control some of those things, but if we can try to think about what are helpful options for us as parents, what helps me cope, taking a walk, listening to an audiobook, you know, that telling my child right now, I feel kind of upset and I'm going to take 3 deep breaths before I answer your question, but I'm going to get back to you. That those are things that they can see moving forward, and maybe they wouldn't have had the opportunity to learn some of those coping skills, you know, if this didn't happen.
You know, and I think also some kids are one friend that I know, a colleague, has a son who had never really loved playing musical instruments, but during COVID, he has started playing multiple musical instruments. So I think there are opportunities here that may have never presented themselves before for people to learn new things that bring them joy and fulfillment. So
that's nice to have a positive. I mean, everything is so shaken up now. It's nice to see that there might be some positive aspects to it. Mm-hmm. Susan on Facebook she says, I am a special education teacher. I will be back in the classroom. We are to wear masks and social distance, but I know that hugging and holding preschoolers is important. I plan to continue to do this if they need it. Any other ideas to get close with 3 to 5-year-olds or how to comfort them without physical contact? That's a tough one.
So I have heard of, you know, a strategy of giving a child like a quick hug from behind instead of right in front of their face. You know, that with my father-in-law, you know, he's kind of older, so we're trying to be really careful. And if we do ever see him, it's really hard for him not to hug them. So we're all masked up and to give like a squeeze, you know, from behind. I think it's also what you say to children, even that young, can have a big impact. Like, oh, I can see how you're feeling like you could really use some comfort right now. I would love to hug and squeeze you. Is there something else that would make you feel comfortable? Sometimes even holding hands and walking with the teacher, and then you can wash your hands. So, you know, little ones are tough because they don't keep all of their saliva and things where it's supposed to be. So it's even more challenging to address that. But I think that most people, if they think creatively, can probably find ways to show warmth and empathy to children without it being physical or super close all the time. But it's a change for sure.
Young children also sometimes have their own love objects, like, you know, teddy bears and things like that. And, you know, you can be creative with the use of those kinds of objects. And you know, I think that might provide some comfort for children as well as pets. I mean, pets can be a wonderful source of comfort. So.
You know, I know it's probably pretty common to be a little nervous around a new school year in general. So what are the signs that a child's worries are going beyond kind of regular level nerves? And when is it appropriate to seek clinical help?
Yeah, so there's two areas that we sort of evaluate when we're trying to consider if anxiety has reached that level where we're talking about clinical significance or into a point where we would want the family to seek help. And the one area is how severe is the anxiety. So we think of it, you know, we use a little thermometer scale to kind of make ratings of how severe is the child's anxiety when they have to face this area. And that helps us think about it. The other area is how much interference is it causing in your life? So an example is, you know, one child could be afraid of, you know, going to sleep at night, and their family is able to kind of, you know, do that thing where you look for evidence of proof. Is there anything bad we think is happening right now? Okay, we don't think there is anything, so maybe the anxiety is kind of messing with you a little bit, and we're going to have you try to go to sleep and think about going to the lake this weekend. And so that's a little bit of anxiety, a little bit of interference maybe, but there's some kids who it's hours to try to get them to go to sleep or stay in their own bed. And so you're talking about interference that's, really rising to that point that this is causing a lot of stress for the family. So severity and interference are two areas that we look at to figure out, is this at that range where we say, it's kind of reached that problem range in at least one area of their life, and we would want to help them, seek out a professional to assist with that.
One thing that another fortunate aspect that COVID has hastened is the use of telepsychiatry. So it's actually become now very accepted practice that a lot of the psychiatric kind of visits or mental health related visits that we have going on are done over, links, Zoom links or other telehealth kinds of links. And so it's actually, could be relatively simple to get more serious kinds of help from providers. So yeah, at UC Davis, we're really a leader in telehealth, as I'm sure you know.
Yes, and I was going to ask, like, what if a child is diagnosed with anxiety, what are the tools you can use to treat them? I guess telemedicine is a really great way to go. Is that effective in kids both with autism spectrum disorder and kids without it?
I think we don't have a lot of great studies at this point on whether telehealth is effective, but I would guess from what we're observing clinically that it can be highly effective. A little bit more to your question about what helps kids. That's what Brianna and I are studying in this particular STAR study for children with autism. And the STAR study kind of mirrors what's been done in kids that don't have autism. So we're testing the effectiveness of one intervention that's called cognitive behavior therapy for anxiety. And that's really an evidence-based practice at this point for dealing with children and anxiety. And, the kind of slogan of CBT is change the way you think, change the way you feel. And that's what we do with children. We work with them one-on-one to understand just what their particular fears and things that make them anxious are. And we practice with them to gain exposure so they no longer avoid and they become less anxious. So in the trial, we're testing one form of CBT that's been validated for children with autism. Then we're also using medications because we have a number of medications that are used with individuals with children with typical development or adults with typical development. And those have in early trials been shown to be efficacious. Sometimes the cognitive behavior therapy or CBT is used in conjunction with the medication. So that's us. The trial is called the STAR trial. And if people have children with autism ages 9 to 14 and are interested in potentially participating in that study, we still are actively recruiting families. And there should be a link coming up in your box to Taryn Heckers about that. But so go back to your question, medications can be very effective. This therapy called cognitive behavior therapy can be very effective. And another thing we're learning during the pandemic is that they can all be done online. We've been managing folks for their medications online, having them meet with psychiatrists online, and also delivering cognitive behavior therapy online, and are actually trying to get ready to work with our colleagues across the state to make our CBT, this protocol, available online. So stay tuned. It's still not been approved at our institution, but if you're interested, you should contact the link, and you might not even have to be that close to Sacramento to participate.
Well, this has been really great. Your work is so important and relevant, especially right now. And I have to say, we've been getting a lot of appreciation and support from our viewers for you both in the comments as people have been watching this. So thank you so much for sharing all of your work and knowledge with us.
Thanks for having us.
Our pleasure.
Brianna Winder-Patel is a clinical psychologist at the UC Davis Mind Institute and assistant clinical professor in the Department of Pediatrics. Marjorie Solomon is professor of clinical psychiatry at UC Davis and is on the faculty of the Mind Institute as well. Next time, we'll look into how the pandemic has affected transportation and mobility and how wealth and social class factor in. Until then, I'm Satirius Johnson, and this is UC Davis Live COVID-19.